All right, how's it going, guys? Pretty good? All right, so just a couple of things. So today is the 21st. Your first assignment is due on the 23rd by midnight to my email. Is that your understanding too? Yeah, all right. So I really look forward to reading everything you have to say. Don't freak out. It's just pretty easy. If you apply yourself to those questions in a way that shows that you're just thinking deeply about them, given the complications I've been telling you that come with thinking philosophically, you'll do absolutely fine. So that's that. Last class, we left off with one piece of unfinished business with respect to God, and then we're about to move on to an entirely new topic. We talked about this issue of God's perfection, right? And Anselm is the person who really took that concept of perfection to its ultimate logical conclusion. God is so perfect as a concept that you might even think this has implications about other properties that he might have, such as existence or him being real. Now, there's another philosopher known as Leibniz. Just so you know, Leibniz is a complete genius, German philosopher from the 1700s. He co-invented calculus with Newton, and he's just a brilliant guy. But he did apply himself to philosophy as well. And one result of him applying himself to philosophy is that he thought very deeply about one particular issue with respect to God. That's a very deep issue. Whether you're a non-believer or a believer, one thing you're going to struggle with is the fact that calling God good and powerful and wise is a reflection, as we said, of some deeper property that is reflected in all of those, which is perfection. If you wanted to sum up what God really is, Leibniz does an excellent summary. He says, God is absolutely perfect in all possible respects. I mean, not even Anselm had actually said that, but Leibniz has this ability to go straight to the point and to get the essence of what's going on. And so even though in what we read from Anselm doesn't use the word perfect or perfection, Leibniz has this amazing ability to zero in on the essence of God, what people have been talking about all these centuries and all these millennia. And he says, you know what? The concept that we need to thoroughly understand God is perfection. Now, Anselm went in the direction of, okay, if God has this property of perfection, then that implies he also has this property of existence. Leibniz is going to do something else. Leibniz is going to say, since God is absolutely perfect in all possible respects, that means that he's perfect metaphysically, meaning he's the most real being. Not just that he is real, but he's the most real being. And morally, meaning what? God is as good as anyone can be. He's the best. He is perfectly good. But this commits Leibniz to something that a lot of us are going to resist. Because if God is so perfect and everything he does is so good, all of his actions are good, right? Then that means if he creates a world, what qualities would you expect that world to have? I think you know where I'm going with this, right? If God is absolutely perfect in all respects, then anything he thinks or does or feels or says will also be perfect. So if the world is created by God, as many of our religions tell us, especially the Abrahamic religions, it has implications for that world. That world isn't just going to be good, it's going to be a masterpiece. It's going to be as perfect as conceivably possible. It's going to be as perfect as conceivably possible. So when we really think this through, what we're saying is this. In normal language, what we're actually saying is that, hey, how are you doing? No problem. What we're actually saying, guys, is this: optimism is justified, like a radical optimism. And what is optimism about this world? It basically is like, this is the best of all possible worlds. That's what Leibniz really wants us to believe. This is as good as it gets. There is no other possible world that's even better than this. And it's interesting because Leibniz is one of those philosophers who wrote so much, but most of the stuff he wrote is in really short letters, writing to other scholars of his time. And he didn't condense a lot of his work into a lot of publications. He only published about 2 or 3 things in his whole career. And one of them, guys, if you want to know how serious he was about religion and God, one of the 2 things he published was a book called Theodicy. And what is Theodicy? Theodicy is a defense of God and a justification of his ways, even though to us, his ways might appear cruel or neglectful. You know what I mean? So he's defending, what Leibniz is doing is, he's defending God against accusations that he is either neglectful or even cruel or hateful. Now, what feature of the world would suggest to someone that either optimism is unjustified or that God is not good and that he's actually pretty mean or pretty just careless? What feature of the world would suggest that? Evil, very good. There it is, guys, there it is. So how can Leibniz argue that this is the best of all possible worlds when it has evil in it? That's what we're going to study from the text today. And then we're going to finish up on that and move right on to the next topic. So guys, there are 2 arguments he offers in the text that I gave you to read. The first one goes something like this. Whoever does not design the best possible world must be lacking in power or goodness or wisdom. Do you see that? Whoever does not design the best possible world must be lacking in power or goodness or wisdom. That's where he starts. And then, next thing he does after that is he says, the typical argument goes, God did not design the best possible world. So if you take those 2 statements, what conclusion does it support? We start off with, whoever does not design the best possible world is lacking in power, goodness, or wisdom, basically perfection. He's lacking in perfection. God did not design the best possible world. Therefore, what conclusion do these people who want to attack God reach? What conclusion is Leibniz trying to attack? The idea that what? Do you see those statements? Do you see the connection between those statements? Whoever does not design the best world must be lacking in power, goodness, or wisdom, meaning perfection. God did not design the best possible world. Therefore, what's the conclusion? God is not perfect. Exactly. God is not perfect. And that's something that Leibniz just cannot tolerate, is either atheists attacking God that way, using evil as an argument against God. Say, hey, the world has evil, so either God doesn't exist, or he does exist, but he's not as powerful as we thought he was. He's not as perfect as we thought he was, that kind of thing. So Leibniz gets on it. He says right away, okay, it's true. I agree with you. Your first statement, your first premise, whoever does not design the best is not perfect or is lacking in power, goodness, and wisdom. Leibniz agrees with that. But he disagrees that God did not design the best. That God is not the best. He disagrees with people who say God is not the best. Now, how is he going to attack that? Well, he does some further analysis. He makes another argument supporting the second premise of the first argument. And he says what people do is what they do is this. They say, oh, okay. In fact, it's really short, so let's go ahead and look at exactly the language he uses, because this is very important. He says, I just want to quote it. He says, whoever makes things in which there is evil, which could have been made without evil, or the making of which could have been omitted, does not choose the best, right? Think about that. If you truly had the power to prevent evil from being a feature of the world, then if you permit it, what does that say? That says that you did not choose the best possible world. Then he goes on, he says, the next premise is God has made a world in which there is evil, a world, I say, which could have been made without any evil, or the making of which could have been omitted altogether. So he's saying anyone who allows evil in the world when designing the world is not choosing the best. God allowed evil, therefore, God did not choose the best. Right? That's how people are supporting that second premise from the first argument. And now he's going to do some analysis. He's going to say, this is absolutely unacceptable. You cannot support your premise this way because this first premise of the second argument, whoever makes things in which there is evil does not choose the best, he's going to attack that. And he's going to attack that by saying this. Yes, it's true. God could have made a world where there was absolutely no evil and there was nothing but good. But God doesn't just make a world where there's a lot of good and no evil. God does what? He designs a world in which he maximizes good. And then here's the catch. What if God allows a little bit of evil as a necessary condition to maximize good? And that's what Leibniz wants to get in your mind. He wants you to say, yes, it's true. God did allow evil in the world. Let's not deny that. But when someone allows a feature like evil in the world, we shouldn't think it's arbitrary or accidental. When he allows something like evil in the world, it must be a kind of necessary feature in the overall economy of producing good. You see that? It's like a necessary feature. He wasn't careless. It wasn't accidental. It is an integral part of the design. It's deliberate, and not just deliberate, but it maximizes good somehow. That's what he wants us to believe. And how does he support that? Well, he has this really interesting analogy. He says, think of a general in a war. Now, the highest good for a general in a war is glory. He would rather fight a really glorious fight that gives him really glorious victory, even if that means he's going to get a couple of wounds, than to play it safe and not fight and just remain happy and healthy. Do you see that? That's the analogy he's going to say. That's the analogy. Now, how does this translate into theological terms? In strictly theological terms, what he's saying is God allowed evil because it was it was almost like a logical necessity for him to allow some evil so that he could maximize the total amount of good. So he could have eliminated evil, that's true, but he would not thereby have maximized good. There would have been a world where there was nothing but good, but it might be a kind of lukewarm good, you know what I mean? Or a bland. When you hear this word bland, if food is bland, what is it? What are we saying about food that's bland? Exactly. It would be kind of like that. You know, there are different aspects to a meal. We want it to be wholesome and nutritious. That's good, right? Wholesome and nutritious is good. But there are aesthetic aspects to cuisine as well, you know? We want it to be tasty and, you know, flavorful, that kind of thing. Well, yeah, God could have made a bland world where everybody was quote unquote good, right? A bunch of robots, a bunch of zombies who worship him like robots. And I mean, yeah, nobody hurts anybody, and everything goes along well. The economy is great. Politics is great. Everything is great. But there'll be something a bit off about that kind of world. Whereas if he allows evil, that creates a new dynamic where the tension between the good and the evil causes people to strive more. They're more passionate. And this world is going to be a lot more chaotic and turbulent than the former world. But when you look at the total economy of good, it will actually reach maximums of good that the other world would never even dream of. This concept of utopia is a very interesting thing. If you look at all the historical attempts at utopia, a lot of them have ended very in disaster. Whether it's communism or fascism, a lot of them don't end well. Whereas environments where there's a lot of tension and competition and where it looks like there's a lot of evil, but if you look at the outcome and you look at the longevity of those kinds of systems, they seem to not only endure longer, but they seem to be more personally rewarding when people have to work for what they get. You know what I mean? Kind of like what you get in capitalism. So long as the capitalism is occurring not like crony capitalism, but it's more like a capitalism within the context of a democratic republic with a liberal constitution, that kind of thing. Environments where people are more vigorous, where they have to exert themselves, all of that could be called evil, right? I got to exert myself. I got to put effort. Is that evil or no? It makes you think, right? Every day I have to wake up and work hard. Now, according to the utopia people, is that evil? It's not evil, no, it's rewarding. Now, God allowed that kind of situation. He allowed a situation where you have to fight for your survival. That's an evil. Your body has to undergo wear and tear. But there's more reward. Capitalist systems generate more net worth, more GDP than other systems. And people feel more fulfilled in their lifestyles. At least it's arguable. I mean, some socialist countries also do very well in their own respects. But this is the kind of thing that Leibniz wants us to consider, basically, is that a general who wants to maximize glory will be like, look, I'm going to sacrifice a few soldiers, and I myself will get a few wounds. But I will go down in history as one of the greatest generals ever. I'm going to be like Napoleon or Caesar or Alexander. But there's some evil. You see that? You're going to get some wounds. You're going to lose some lives. Compared to a general who just says, you know what? I'm going to keep my army well fed. We're going to, do some exercises every few days. We're going to play it safe. Okay, if safety is the measure of goodness, fine. That is a perfect world. That's a utopia. But, when you look at the world aesthetically, remember aesthetics is one branch of axiology. Glory is a very aesthetic quality. You know what I mean? If you're fighting for glory, someone like Elon Musk wants glory. You know what I mean? Like, he's not even motivated by money. He just wants to be remembered in history, kind of. You see what I'm saying? Glory in a military context, glory in a financial or economic context among entrepreneurs, right? Bill Gates is going to go down in history, right? And then glory in a religious context. God wants glory. So what will give him most glory? Not a bunch of robots praising him. No, he says, hey, I'm gonna mix things up. I'm gonna give everyone the freedom to choose me or not to choose me. And this world in which there's freedom, that freedom is also gonna allow possibilities of evil. But you know what? There's gonna be a lot of evil, but there's also gonna be a lot of growth. People are gonna learn from their mistakes. There's gonna be a lot of repentance. And eventually, I'm gonna get a lot of glory because the few people who do choose me, that's gonna be a more satisfying victory to have someone intentionally, deliberately choose me choose to submit to me, choose to glorify me, than a bunch of robots that I've designed to praise me. You see that? All right, guys. So that's the first argument. That's how Leibniz wants us to think about evil. Not as an objection to God, but rather the exact opposite, a part of the design. All right. He also has this argument. I'll just read it out. If there is more evil than good in intelligent creatures, then there is more evil than good in the whole work of God. Now, there is more evil than good in intelligent creatures, therefore there is more evil than good in the whole work of God. So these are basically people who Leibniz has identified as they have problems with God. And they're using either evil itself or just defects in God's design of the world to attack God. And Leibniz isn't having it. He's going to counter every single one of them. So this is another example. Instead of just saying that God didn't choose the best world, now people are saying, okay, there is more evil than good in God's work. So it's not just that God allowed some evil, it's that the proportion of evil to good, there's more evil than good in God's work. So let's start with what he says. If there is more evil than good in intelligent creatures, then there is more evil than good in the whole work of God. Leibniz completely disagrees. He says, first of all, the number of creatures that God has, the total amount, out of that, the proportion that are intelligent, according to Leibniz, is really, really small compared to everything else. It would be like taking all living creatures and comparing them to all the atoms in the universe, including the ones that the living creatures are made up of. Now, Leibniz is making some interesting suggestion here because he's saying basically, look, the perfection that God has put in the world and its design isn't just in intelligent creatures, whether it's atoms or molecules, whatever structure, whatever entity you can think of, there's a level of perfection there that comes from God's craftsmanship. And so what he's basically arguing is that the whole quantity of all of the excellence of God's craftsmanship, if you take up all of the entire domain of non-intelligent creatures, that amount of perfection and goodness will proportionally outweigh any amount of evil you find among the intelligent creatures. That's what he's trying to suggest. He's saying, yeah, you can find some evil among intelligent creatures like human beings, but there's far more perfection distributed very widely among all the other creatures in the universe. And then there's the other proposition, right? Now, there is more evil than good in intelligent creatures. That's another premise that these people have to support. And Leibniz disagrees with that once again. He says, you're saying that among intelligent creatures, right, there's more evil than good in them. He says, I don't even agree with that either. So there's two levels of analysis to this. The first is human beings, and then the first is the entire group of intelligent creatures. He starts with human beings. He says, look, if you add up all of the human beings who are evil and all the human beings who are bad, I agree. At first, it looks like most human beings are bad, right? Most human beings are evil, and the number of human beings that are good seems small. But he has this really interesting metaphysics. And we should spend a little time on this because I would love to know what you think about this. For Leibniz, evil is itself an imperfection. I just want to highlight that. For Leibniz, evil is itself an imperfection. So how do we characterize evil? It's something like this. Perfection is what's real and good and true. And then all evil things are kind of like the absence of perfection. Do you see that? Kind of like a shadow is the absence of light. You see that? A shadow is the absence of light. So evil is not positive. You see that? You see what I'm saying? Evil Evil doesn't consist in presenting anything. Evil is purely negative. It's just the absence of good. You see that? Evil is just the absence of good, not the presence of evil. Evil itself is not the presence of anything. It's just the absence of good. Now, why is this important? Well, even though most of the human race is evil, since evil is an imperfection, what does that mean? It doesn't matter how many evil people you have, since the quality they have is imperfect, that means it has very low value, right? Now, here's the trick. So most of the human race is bad. A little bit of the human race is good, but the ones who are good are really, really perfect in a very high degree. They are, you know, an asymptote? Do you know what an asymptote is? They are approximating the goodness of the God himself. They'll never reach it, but they're approaching it. Now, God's goodness is infinite, unbound. Now, because he's infinite, that means the degrees of perfection get exponentially higher. There are orders of magnitude of perfection. And then compared with these evil people, no matter how evil you try to be, let's say you're a Satanist and you worship Satan and you just try to be like Satan and you just crowd demons into your soul, there are limits to that. Because evil is imperfect, it's inherently limited. No matter how evil you try to be, let me give you guys some insight. Have you heard of a poet called Dante? Dante from the High Middle Ages, right before the Renaissance? Dante Alighieri. He wrote something called the Divine Comedy. It's amazing. I read this thing like about a year or two ago. The part that's relevant for us is he starts off with the Inferno. So he describes hell. Now, I want you to note, Dante is brilliant. What he calls God can be seen not so much as a person. You don't see God in the entire Divine Comedy. You can see God in the structure of the universe. The very fact that there is an inferno, there is a purgatory, and there is a paradise, that structure is a kind of symbol of God's justice. You know what I mean? Because in hell, the people who have rejected God have pushed themselves into an imperfect environment. In the deepest levels of hell, guys, God doesn't have a bunch of doors closing people in. Guess what? In the deepest levels of hell, there's a bunch of people closing doors on God. I mean, this is profound. If you really understand what I'm telling you, it'll help you understand religion a bit better. Some religious people say God doesn't really reject anyone or punish anyone. If you really think about it, it's all on us. So if you reject God, there's a certain imperfection that you are bringing on yourself. You know what I mean? And Dante is representing this symbolically, allegorically. So the very structure of the universe reflects God's justice and grace and mercy and all that. So at the deepest levels of hell, you have people who have built a fortress to keep God out. Now imagine using all your energy to resist light and warmth and goodness and grace. That's an imperfect state of being. And that's why, according to Christians, at the end of the universe, when Jesus comes back, every knee shall bow. All right? Because at the end of the day, you're using all this energy to resist something that your soul really wants. You're not going to win. The devil will lose, according to Christianity. But there's a very important reason why you'll lose. You're using all this energy against your natural impulse. You want God's goodness. You want his grace. You want his love. But you have an imperfection in you, sin, that makes you try to resist what's naturally good for you. So at the deepest levels of hell, people are rejecting God. And then guess who's at the very bottom of hell? One figure in particular. You probably know who I'm talking about, right? This book is called The Inferno. So who's at the very bottom of hell in a pool of ice? Like just almost crystallized in a posture of rejecting God. It's the devil, Lucifer. I mean, Dante is brilliant. But the point is this. Evil is finite, it's limited, it's bound. There's only so far you can go in being evil. At some point, at the maximum level of evil, either you will crystallize like the devil is, or you'll just stop existing. You know what I mean? Like, there's limits. But there is no limit to how good you can be. So what does that say? If you take all bad people, what Leibniz is saying, you take all bad people and you add up all their evil, and you take the small good people and you add up all their good, because they are approximating infinity, he says in theory they could still, if you compared them, even though they're much smaller, the proportion or the degree of their goodness could outweigh the evil, because the evil is imperfect and therefore very finite. Does that make sense? That's Leibniz, guys. I mean, we don't have much more to say. The other thing he talks about is about how even if we don't focus on the human race, if we focus on all intelligent creatures, Leibniz is being very speculative here. He's saying, look, you're saying there's more evil than good in intelligent creatures, but what about all the angels and all the spirits and all this and that, you know, all the things that we never see in our regular world? What about all of that? All intelligent creatures includes all invisible intelligent creatures. How many angels are there? So he says, the number of angels and good spirits in the world probably outweighs all the negative spirits in the world. And that's that. I mean, guys, he's speculating. How does he know any of this? I mean, he says stuff like, I have the right to suppose that a thing is possible so long as its impossibility is not proved. And indeed, what I have here advanced is more than a supposition. You're talking about spirits and stuff, and this is the best you can say. I have the right to suppose that a thing is possible so long as its impossibility is not proved. Is that really supporting something? I have the right to suppose that a thing is possible so long as its impossibility is not proved. That's like saying, oh, I didn't contradict myself, so obviously I'm probably right. I love Leibniz, but he didn't support it very well. You know what I mean? You got to call people out, keep them accountable. All right, guys, any questions? Let's move on to the next topic. Any questions? All right. So, guys, we are on September 21st. So we're starting the mind-body problem. And the first person we're going to look at to introduce us to this mind-body problem is Descartes. Descartes, guys, is considered the founder of modern philosophy, and I think rightly so. He's a person who took an environment where one philosopher called Aristotle had dominated European thought so much that it was beginning to get a bit dogmatic and kind of like mechanical, like really, like people were just accepting what Aristotle had to say as if it were authority. And even the church had done this, right? Like Aquinas was a great philosopher, but he took Aristotle almost for granted, and then he tried to marry Aristotle and Christianity. That's what Aquinas had did 300 years before Descartes. But Descartes is called the founder of modern philosophy, mainly because he says, look, it's not that I'm saying Aristotle is wrong. It's more like I'm saying we need to just have a fresh start on everything. And so he creates an independent inquiry into the same kinds of things that all people had thought before, but his method is new, and there's a kind of freshness to his approach. Remember, he's an amateur. Remember I talked a long time ago about how a lot of the great philosophers were not professors. They weren't professional philosophers, they were amateurs. Well, this is a guy who's an amateur. He has his own money, and he's perfectly comfortable. He doesn't need to be a teacher or a professor for a living. And he just absorbs himself in thinking about things. He was taught by the Jesuits, but he doesn't, follow the Jesuits on everything. And he just absorbs himself in the contemplation and working out of very interesting problems. And he comes up with conclusions that we all already agree with, but he gives a new understanding of what philosophy can be. And also along the way to his conclusions, he makes some really remarkable detours that have contributed permanent and lasting changes to the orientation and the emphasis in philosophy. And we're about to get into that right now because these changes we're talking about are very, very profound. All right. So, Descartes. All right, guys. So we are switching topics. We're not talking about God anymore right now. We're talking about the mind-body problem. And let me look at the time. 7:10. Okay, good. So guys, in the background, as we go through Descartes, I just want you to keep what I'm about to say in mind. I remember when I was introducing this class, the first few days or weeks or whatever, I did ask you to think about something, which is we take it for granted, typically, that we have bodies, or maybe that we are bodies, right? We identify with our bodies a lot, you know? But I also asked you, do you feel comfortable saying that you are only a body, right? And I think most of you were kind of like, no, there's something not quite right about the idea that I'm only a body. And this mind-body problem that we're about to start talking about, it goes deep into that, right? It goes really, really deep. Because, fine, so you know that you have a body or you are a body, but you don't identify totally with your body. You also identify with something else. Now, what is that something else? If you had to give it a name, what would you call that other thing that you feel uncomfortable leaving out of your account of your personal identity or yourself? Your soul, exactly. Now, what are more sophisticated names for the soul? Back in the day, they used to call it soul or spirit. But after psychology got really, really advanced, especially after a German philosopher called Wilhelm Wundt, we get now, people don't call it soul anymore. What do they call it? The mind. Very good. So even a psychoanalysis, right? A psychoanalyst like Freud or, you know, Jung, they'll talk about your psyche. They'll talk about, you know, this part of you that has all these psychological forces. And they don't talk about the soul in the same old school way that the religions did. And they'll talk about your mind and its, you know, cognitive aspects, its emotional aspects, things like that. So yeah, this thing called the mind. It's weird, but what in the world is that? For one thing, the only reason why we thought that you had a body is because your body is visible. Now, you identify with your body because it's visible and you probably feel some sense of control over different parts of your body. But now, this thing called the mind, if we're going to be strictly experimental and kind of empirical, what could ever justify us in saying that we're more than a body or bodies aren't the only things that exist? Descartes is about to give us a brilliant example of this, but I'm just trying to push you in the direction of seeing why we call it the mind-body problem. Because some philosophers think, hey, what you see is what's real, and anything unseen is unreal. There are philosophers who believe that. A lot of them are scientists, and a lot of them are philosophers who just reject anything spooky or anything mysterious or unexplainable. So I'm just challenging you. I'm putting the burden on you. You know, you have another essay coming up, a second essay. You've seen the structure of my essay so far. I'm going to ask you a question like, do you believe you have a mind? If so, why? You have to think about that. And you have to think about what theory of knowledge, right? What kind of epistemology entitles you to believe what you believe? If you believe you have a mind, you've got to give me a good reason why you believe you have a mind. If you believe you're only a body, I want a theory of knowledge for that too. You know, those are the things we're going to get into. It's really, really rich stuff. I'm going to show you the landscape and then we're going to get into Descartes. Some people say, hey, the only thing that exists is bodies and matter. And they are called materialists, right? It makes sense. a lot of scientists are materialists. A lot of Anglo-American, that is English and American universities are full of scientists and philosophers who are materialists. Now, it's not so much that they've proven that matter or body is the only thing that exists. It's more like that's what they really, really want to acknowledge. And so all that they publish are things, arguments supporting that, and things like that. Whether or not they've been successful, I'll leave up to you. But yes, our modern culture, our contemporary culture in academic and professional philosophy is very, very materialist. And it's excusable in a certain sense, right? Because if physics and chemistry and biology have been so successful in so many ways compared to philosophy, right? Philosophy has given us no periodic table. It's given us no taxonomy, nothing. I mean, progress in philosophy sounds kind of weak, if there is such a thing. Sounds like philosophers just each generation talk about the same thing. Fair enough. So some philosophers and scientists say, hey, all this progress we're making in physics and chemistry and biology and the natural sciences, doesn't that suggest that we can understand everything in terms of pure matter? Isn't everything just a metal or a non-metal or a metalloid? Isn't everything, some form of matter or energy? Doesn't that exhaust everything that exists? Why would we introduce spooky, mysterious elements that just mess up our nice little categories and systems? So it's understandable that they would do that. However, the responsible philosopher always points out flaws where they are, all right? So there's another type of philosopher, the idealist. The idealist says, the only thing that exists is mind. He contradicts the materialist. The only thing that exists is mind. Now think about that, guys. Just take a moment where you are and think about that. You might think you're just a body. But I want to suggest to you, there's another philosopher who could come along and say, you know what? It's the exact opposite. You are just a mind. Now you might be like, what are you talking about, man? I'm just a mind? I can look at my mind. I can look at my body. I can see it. So I know I have a body and I have no evidence that I have a mind. How will an idealist support this reversal? He's going to say this. He's going to say, you don't know those parts of your body that you think you know. What you know are ideas of your body. You see that? You have perceptions of your body. That's what you're familiar with. Do you see that? That's a complete mind bender. I was going to use another word. If you think about that, that will twist your mind. What I really know is not my hand, but a representation of my hand in my mind. So, what do I really know? All I know is my mind, and I know that my mind is full of ideas, all sorts of ideas, simple ideas, complex ideas, ideas of color, ideas of shape, ideas of size. You see where things are going? Suddenly the idealist can be like, hey, what's all this talk about matter? That's the one that we don't have evidence for. I have never seen matter. I've seen ideas that are either simple or complex. I have never seen matter. There's a philosopher named Berkeley, George Berkeley. He spent his entire career contradicting materialists. And he didn't just say matter doesn't exist. He's also known as an immaterialist, but he said mind is the only thing that exists. The only thing you know, the only thing any human being has ever known is ideas in his own mind. His hand is an idea. This room is an idea. No matter where you go, you are just perceiving more and more ideas. If you go into the galaxies, yes, stars are ideas. If you go into quantum mechanics, quarks and strings, those are more ideas. You cannot escape idealism. That's why it's called idealism, because it claims that all that we really know are not things, but ideas. And that's it. All right? Then there's what Descartes is. Descartes is a dualist. He believes that we're both mind and body. So I'm showing you the landscape, right? You can be a materialist, you can be an idealist, you can be a dualist. You can also be Now, okay, so among these materialists, I just want to I want to show you one aspect that has two dimensions. If you're a materialist, what you will try to do is you will try to take what the idealist says resists being accounted for materially, and then you will engage in what is called reductionism. So when a philosopher is reducing one thing to another, what he's saying is both of these things exist, but when properly understood, they coincide in one thing. So when someone reduces the mind either to behaviors of the body or to the brain, when someone reduces that, they are materialists. And what they're doing is they're taking the claims that the idealist makes, and they're saying, yes, the things that you say exist, perceptions, ideas, but when properly understood, they coincide with either the brain and its neurochemical activity, or they coincide with the behaviors of the body. And so the mind is not something inside the brain. The mind just is the tendencies and behaviors of the body. The mind isn't a spooky thing. It's just the body behavior properly understood. So these are all ways of reducing the claims of the idealist into the material paradigm or framework. And then there's weirdos called functionalists, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of functionalism, but functionalism basically says, yeah, the people who identify the mind and the mind and the brain, they're onto something, but they've missed the bigger point. It's true that brains instantiate minds or are examples of minds, but they're only examples. There are other examples possible. So what the functionalist thinks, the materialist who identifies the brain as the mind, what the functionalist thinks he's gotten wrong is that he's taken one example of a functional organization that produces minds, and then he's artificially limited it and said, no other system or organization can produce minds but this one. The functionalist says, no. It's not about the particular anatomy and physiology of the brain. Rather, it's about the more abstract organizational structure that permits the mind to function within that structure called the brain. And if properly designed, other structures can also produce the same effect called mind. So what are we talking about here, guys? AI, right? Think about AI. Many people believe that artificial intelligence, computers, is a kind of mind. Some of them claim it's the hardware, some of them claim it's the software, some of them claim that it's both together. But the bottom line is, once you have the right functional and structural arrangement, all you need is a functional structure. And that functional structure can realize the mind the same way the brain can. So functionalism is this idea of multiple realizability. In other words, many different systems, if they're abstractly understood and designed, can realize the same thing called the mind. You see that? The people who just say it's only the brain, they have artificially narrowed the number of things that can do that. And then the last people I'm going to leave you with are a very weird number of people. They're called eliminative materialists. And an eliminative materialist is crazy, right? This person is going to say, the other type of materialism where you identify the mind with the brain or with the behavior of the body, that's wrong. And it's wrong because it didn't go far enough. It's not wrong because idealism is right. It's wrong for the opposite reason. It wasn't radical enough. Because, remember, like I said, the idealist says that there's this weird stuff called ideas and perceptions or intuitions. And then what the materialist does, he tries to take all of that and preserve it while only talking about this material stuff. So the eliminative materialist is going to say, look, That earlier type of materialism is bound to fail, but for a very important reason. There's nothing to reduce. There are no ideas, there are no perceptions, there are no mental states, there's no mind, there aren't even beliefs or desires or anything like that. All that there is what science, and in particularly neuroscience, tells us there is. So do you see why it's called eliminative materialism? It's called eliminative materialism because it eliminates all that spooky mental stuff completely. There is no mind, there are no mental states, there's no perception, no memory, no imagination, no ideas, nothing. All there is matter and material states and maybe energy. And that's it. And that's crazy because they are denying subjectivity. You see that? You see what I mean when I say they're denying subjectivity? There's something it feels like when someone stabs you in the arm. It's called pain. Now, this eliminative materialist is going to tell you while you're in pain that you don't feel what you feel. He's going to try to explain it away purely in material, objective terms. But that's denying your subjectivity. And that's a burden they have to bear in terms of their theories. All right, guys, let's get into Descartes. So Descartes is a Catholic philosopher. He learned from the Jesuits. He's still a devout Catholic. He wants to show that God exists, that we exist, that minds exist, and that material, matter, and bodies exist. That's his agenda. And he says his agenda right at the beginning of the book that we're reading, the Meditations. He says, that's what I intend to do. So he's going to give back to us all that we already had, but he's going to go through a line of reasoning that's very fresh, very amateur, and it's kind of like he's going to discover along the way some features of what we are and our ontology that we might not have recognized. And here's how he gets started. He says, I'm a middle-aged man now, and one of the things I've noticed about myself is that when I was younger, I just accepted a lot of things from my culture because I was educated that way. But a lot of the things I was told, a lot of the ideas and the beliefs and the values, they were false, or at least they were uncertain, right? They weren't really solid. And what he's going to say is that as a philosopher, what a philosopher really is someone who can't tolerate uncertainty. That's what a philosopher truly is. So if I look back on my life and I realize I've been deluded and I've been misled and, maybe out of laziness or sloth, I've just taken in a whole bunch of doctrines and beliefs and I haven't examined them for myself. Remember what Socrates said? The unexamined life is not living. Well, here's an example of that. Here's a philosopher who said, you know what? I've been a sloth a little bit. I've accumulated all this stuff from my culture. I'm believing in all sorts of things and I have no proof. So as a real philosopher, for once, Descartes says, real philosophy involves, for once, questioning everything you believe and creating a new foundation for your new beliefs. The old foundation must have been weak. Why? Because it allowed all this falsehood and all this confusion and all this uncertainty. So you've got to destroy the foundation and create a new solid foundation, or at least hopefully discover a new foundation, and hopefully, God willing, you'll get somewhere with that. But the way things are, he says, I am bankrupt. I believe a whole bunch of stuff and I have no good reason for it. So what's his agenda? He has got to destroy the entire building, the entire superstructure of all of his beliefs. He's got to tear it down. All of his beliefs that are not absolutely certain and indubitable and unshakable, he has got to destroy all of them. But guys, there's two issues here, and I want you to think deeply about them. One, how many beliefs do you have? And how many beliefs does the average human being have? if you're going to tear down all your beliefs, we run into a logistical problem, right? How many beliefs do you think you have? And even deeper than how many beliefs do you think you have, how many beliefs are you conscious of compared to the ones you're unconscious of? Do you see what I'm saying? Like let's assume that he is going to challenge all his beliefs. Well, what is he talking about? Is he talking about the conscious ones or the unconscious ones? You see what I'm saying, right? Like human beings are very complex, and no, people like Freud and Jung and these great psychologists, they reveal that we're not transparent to ourselves. You know what I mean? You know what I mean by transparent, right? Like we think, someone like Descartes suggests that I know all of my beliefs. Someone like Freud would be like, no, you don't. And if you spend a little time on my couch, por favor, you'll discover that there's stuff from your childhood, there's all sorts of complexes, and there's all sorts of stuff going on in your psyche that you're not aware of. And if I analyze your dreams and other things, I'll start to realize certain fears you have, which implies certain beliefs you have that you don't even know. So I just want to raise that flag because Descartes is one of those people who believes we're transparent to ourselves. I cannot be wrong about what's going on in my mind, according to Descartes. And I just think modern, like where we are now in our culture, we can't accept that. There's no way you can know everything going on in your psyche. The vast majority of the activity going on in your mind or your soul is unconscious. And it's weird, but that's probably true. So what it is to be a human being is a very complex and a very secret thing. Like we don't know most of it. Even through introspection, we still don't know most of it. Maybe meditation might help, psychoanalysis might help, but the bottom line is when we enter the modern world after Freud and people like Nietzsche, the human being is just a very wonderful, mysterious thing, and he's largely unknown. We don't know a lot about him. But anyway, let's just assume that he's going to question all of his beliefs and that either he has no unconscious beliefs or he's going to question all beliefs, including the unconscious ones. Now, there's a logistical problem. Even putting that aside, let's say he has all of his beliefs right now current in his mind. What is the problem? There's a problem. There's a logistical problem. It has to do with the quantity of your beliefs. Can you see the problem? How many beliefs do you have? Just the sheer volume of them. Are you really going to be able to question each and every one of your beliefs? I don't think so. And neither does he. You have too many beliefs. I mean, like, you have beliefs probably that you haven't even made conscious or made clear yet, right? Like, you have beliefs about what you had for breakfast. You have beliefs about where University of Miami is located. You have beliefs about your family, beliefs about your history, beliefs about mathematics and geography, and you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of beliefs. So if challenging your beliefs means going belief by belief, you see how that's going to be overwhelming? So he makes a very strategic move. He makes an analogy. He says, what I'm about to do is I'm about to do something like destroying a building. But there's a much more efficient way of destroying a skyscraper than going brick by brick or even floor by floor. What would you do? With one move, you could destroy the whole skyscraper. Excellent. Foundation, right? If you pull out the foundation, the whole thing comes down. So he's got to find a foundation for his beliefs. And he's got to find a reason to tear up the foundation. So what is his foundation? He reflects back and he says, man, if I really think about it, all the beliefs I have and all my values and all my ideas, they come from somewhere. They come from the senses. They come from my senses. And that's where he begins his project of demolition, because he says this. He says, it's not that the senses always deceive me, but it's that they're not always reliable. So, as a matter of being cautious or careful or prudent, if you know that the source of your knowledge is not reliable, then even if it sometimes does tell the truth, you still shouldn't trust it because of its lack of reliability. You see that? It's the general lack of reliability. And he's entertaining things. Yeah, when things are far away, right? When things are far away or when things are really small, your senses deceive you. I mean, when something is far away, it looks small, but then you come close to it, it's big. So this thing called your senses, it deceives you. It treats something that might have an absolute size or an absolute magnitude, and then it represents it differently based on your distance from it. So you can't rely on the senses to give you an accurate representation of the size of things at a distance. Same with something that's very small. It's only relatively small, but if you zoom in on it, it becomes big. So once again, your senses aren't reliable. They tell you one thing in one context and another thing in another context. So that's already some very good reason to doubt the senses. But Descartes is a real philosopher. He says, but wait a minute. Surely it only deceives me in those contexts, the small and the far away. What about what I'm doing right now? He says, I'm sitting in my dressing gown, in my PJs, by the fire, reading a book or writing something. Surely my senses can't be deceiving me right now while I'm reading a book by the fire in my PJs. Surely the senses are reliable in that context. Now, what aspect of human experience does he bring up where eventually the senses turn out to be unreliable even for something like that? You got a hand up? Yeah, go ahead. Very good. What happens when you get too sleepy or tired?
When you start, one eye closes, you start dreaming maybe a little bit, and you wake back up, you might think it's real at the moment.
Absolutely. Yes, dreaming. Guys, there's an aspect of being human that is thoroughly mysterious. Dreaming. We dream on a regular basis. Every 24 hours. Every 24 hours, we engage in hours of REM sleep, which involves dreaming. So why would that undermine the reliability of the senses, even in this context? Why is the fact that you dream sometimes, why does that affect the credibility of the senses, even in a context like this? Because you cannot distinguish between dreaming and being awake, right? Or if you can, then it's hard to say exactly what the difference is. Now, Descartes entertains, yeah, many dreams are crazy and things happen that can never happen in real life. Yeah, that's true. Many dreams are crazy, but not all of them. Some of them are very, you know what I mean? Regular, normal. Not all of them are crazy. Yeah, it's true. In some of them, you're defying the laws of gravity or the laws of nature or whatever. So that's there. And you might say, I can always tell a dream by the fact that weird stuff is happening or abnormal stuff. That's a first attempt, but he's going to cut you back. He's going to say, no. According to his experience, when he says in the text, sometimes he even dreams of the very thing he's doing right now, which is sitting by the fire, reading a text, and in his PJs. So the senses, the activity of the senses, does not allow you to distinguish between waking life and dreaming life. They can be perfectly coincident. And if you can't tell the difference between those two, then the foundation is completely gone. You see that? Now we've succeeded in destroying the foundation. Because you're in the matrix, right? In the matrix, what happens? You guys know what I'm talking about? The matrix? In the matrix, it seems like this is real. But where are you really? You're in some tube filled with liquid, and you're sleeping, and they're relying on your biochemical activity to run their machines. That's what's really happening. But you don't know that. You are completely absorbed and deluded by this dream that you're in, the matrix. So it gets crazy because Descartes is doing this before AI, before film, but he's doing a thought experiment. He's saying, look, it's possible that my waking life could be a dream. And it's very difficult to distinguish dreams from reality. And he's one of the first persons to really make that clear. I think people had already had the idea that life might be a dream, but he's the first to make it a foundational issue and to say that our senses can deceive us so well that we might not be able to distinguish between reality and the dream. And so this is a very big problem. Like, how would you? I just want to take a moment and hear from the class. I mean, how would you distinguish dreams from being awake? I mean, I've never seen Inception or anything like that. I know in the Matrix, they take the easy route out, right? In the Matrix, they just say, when you take a certain pill, you wake up. But of course, that doesn't work, because when you wake up into another world, what will the idealist say? Everything you see is just an idea anyway, right? When you wake up in that new world, okay, there's Zion and there's Morpheus and all of that and Trinity. But what's their status? Don't they have the same status that they had in the other world? You see that? They're ideas. How do you know they're reliable? So that's the flaw with the Matrix. Now, I've never seen Inception. Can you tell me what they would say in Inception or some other movie? I don't know. Is it Inception, the one that's about dreaming and all of that? Go ahead. Okay, so there are certain signs, there are certain reliable signs in the dream world to let you know that is a dream. Yeah. Okay. Now, do they talk about the science behind that? Like what makes it evident that this is a dream, for example, according to them? What's their logic? Because it's violating a natural law. Okay, gotcha. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so Descartes is walking us through that. And what he's saying is, bottom line, I'm never gonna doubt all my beliefs. There are too many of them. More efficient to knock down the foundation. The senses is where I'm gonna focus. And dreaming gives me a very efficient way to destroy the credibility of the senses from end to end, total. And once he's done that, guys, now he's on a trajectory straight towards skepticism. You know what skepticism is? Like, a skeptic is someone who believes knowledge is impossible, that all of his beliefs are either false or whatever. Now, he's using skepticism. He is a skeptic, but only transitionally, or you know what I mean? Like, he's a skeptic because for him, skepticism is a method. He wants to get rid of all the bad, unreliable beliefs. Hopefully, he's only left with what's solid, and then whatever is solid will be the foundation for an entirely new philosophy. In that entirely new philosophy, some things will remain familiar. God, the mind, the body, all those will come back in new forms, but some things will be very different. And that's what we're going to see. Guys, he wrote the meditations. It has 6 meditations total. We're only going to focus on the first 2 because they are the most important. That's where the real modern philosophy begins. The other stuff, like proofs for the existence of God or things like that, all of that, he's not very original there. But the first 2 meditations are very original. All right, so we've got 5 minutes. What do we want to emphasize here? He goes so far with his doubt of the senses that he begins to say, wait a minute, what about things like sciences that have already been established, like physics and astronomy and medicine, they study things that we take for granted in the world. But physics and astronomy and medicine all study ideas from a skeptical point of view, not things, right? So those are out. And then he says, but wait a minute. You mean to tell me that even when I'm dreaming, 2 plus 2 is not 4? So he starts going, he goes away from, you see, physics and astronomy, they all study actual bodies, right? So there are ideas there that may or may not change in different contexts. But what about abstractions, concepts like numbers, right? Surely, even in a dream, he's going to argue, even in a dream, 2 plus 2 is always 4, even in a dream. So there is something certain and indubitable, even in spite of the fact that our senses deceive us. But he's going to say, yeah, thing is, there's another consideration that comes in here. He's going to say, I have this belief in some being called a God. And this God is omnipotent. He can do anything. So even though arithmetic and geometry seem certain to me, what if there's a God who either deceives me directly, even about my logic and my arithmetic, or has allowed me a certain nature that allows me to be deceived even by those kinds of things? So that's the move he's going to make. He's going to say, hey, ultimately our ideas come from something beyond us. God is putting ideas in us. And we've noticed in the regular course of our life, we make a lot of mistakes. So this omnipotent God, I guess he's challenging Leibniz here. This omnipotent God allows us to make errors, right? And if he allows some errors, then what's the difference between none and just allowing all errors, right? Because if God is so good, he shouldn't even allow a few errors, right? We should be perfect, as Leibniz says, since we're his creatures, but we're not perfect. So he allows himself the hypothesis that maybe, just maybe, God has allowed us to have a defective nature where we get things wrong totally. And so in that context, we must withhold assent, not only from things that are completely false, we should also withhold assent from things that are uncertain or that we can't establish certainly. And in that context, the whole building has come down, and meditation 1 was just about destroying the building. And he ratifies it with one last thing. He says, you know, God is good, so I can't do my masterpiece with God. I'm going to put him to the side, and I'm going to invent something else called an evil demon. He says, what if there's an evil demon whose whole job is nothing but to deceive me in every possible respect? This evil demon deceives me so efficiently that I'm walking around thinking I have a body, a mind, that there's a sky, earth, lakes, water, people, buildings. It's all uncertain, and therefore it can all be doubted, and therefore, from Descartes' point of view, all of that is part of the building that comes down. Guys, we have the second meditation coming up next class. It's going to be a lot of fun. I look forward to going through it with you. I'm going to end class here. And yeah, so just remember midnight at Wednesday, midnight is when I expect your papers, and I look forward to going through them. Now we're going to take attendance, and that's that. Any